Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week,
young carers consistently have told us for the last few years and way before that the impact that caring can have on their lives and their mental well-being, but also their kind of physical health if they don't look after themselves.
And I think you've also found evidence that people who are young carers do struggle more so within their education, that they are less likely to achieve the GCSE results as their non-caring peers.
Like a lot of carers experiences, you have a very loving relationship, but it was very challenging, and it was often upsetting and tiring, exhausting, and people around you, friends at school, didn't really quite understand what was going on in your life.
And I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday.
Mental Health Monday with Mick Coyle.
Tackling the stigma.
Hey, it's Mick Coyle here. Welcome once again to Mental Health Monday. I do hope you're well. Thanks for downloading the podcast. As we record this, going out the week that UK comes out of national lockdown, but we are heading back into various different types of tiers. And if you've not been able to do so far, and it might be helpful to you or someone you know, previous episodes of Mental Health Monday have touched on how to best sort of get your head around some of this tiering, particularly if you're in tier 3 still, and it's essentially lockdown continued as we move up to Christmas. So do check out previous editions of Mental Health Monday for conversations in regard to that. And just on a personal note, I hope you and everyone you know is doing well at this particular time. Had a really, really positive feedback from last week's edition of Mental Health Monday, our Young Carers special. There's a part 2 this week, which is really, really fascinating as well. We heard from Tasha, we heard from Amy, and they're brilliant sort of stories, the way they were able to sort of put that across, their experience of living through the pandemic, dealing with all the issues that they're dealing with as young carers as well. We're going to be hearing from, in this week's show, the Carers Trust, their chief exec. Now, Gareth Howells will be sharing his experience, and someone listening to the whole conversation in regard to young carers count, Sir Ed Davey. Now, Sir Ed Davey is the leader of the Lib Dems, and he has been hearing about the work we've been doing, covering the work of young carers, and he wants to take that work to Parliament. So he's also got experience of being a young carer himself. We'll talk about that and why it's so important to get decisions right when it comes to our young carers. As ever, if you're listening to the podcast, if you're able to pop on social media, hashtag Mental Health Monday, tell your friends you're checking out the podcast as well. That helps us get the word out that these stories are being told, and there's a place for these stories to be told as well. Hashtag Mental Health Monday. You can always tag me in them as well. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I'll have my links right at the end of this week's podcast. So 2 guests, Gareth Howells, the CEO of the Carers Trust, and Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Lib Dems. Gareth starts us off this week by first telling us that he himself was a young carer.
Yeah, definitely. So I was a young carer between the ages of about 15 to 18. At the time, I didn't recognise that I was a young carer, like many young carers don't. My mum suffered with breast cancer whilst I was going through kind of that GCSE period and quite a key transition for a young person. And as I kind of look back now, you understand that the pressures that came with in terms of balancing the wanting to go and play football with your friends, the need to be in school regularly to go through your GCSEs, but also the need to be at home with somebody that you kind of love and cherish and be there for them as well at the same time. I think the reflection also is the positives that you learn from that in terms of just the empathy for other people, the understanding that you learn at a young age, and the ability to almost probably mature at that age a little bit quicker than you expect to. So there's both positives and negatives to it.
In terms of young people growing up, you know, because it's home life, it's normality, isn't it? It's normal life for them. As a professional now, looking back at yourself, what are those things that you were doing on a day-to-day basis that makes you think, I was a carer, I was clearly a young carer?
I think there's the practical stuff. So visiting my mum when she was in hospital, she would have 3 different operations in the period of about 12 months, quite major operations as well at the time, reconstructive surgery, etc. So regular visits to hospital, when she was home then in terms of kind of supporting with just movement. She had no movement in her arms because she had lymph nodes removed and different things. So there was the practical tasks of physical help. But I think what goes unnoticed is the emotional toil, actually. For a young boy to be thinking about how his mum was suffering, is probably would have been that long ago, 20 years ago, a bit more stigmatized than it is now. Actually, for me to be able to would never have talked to my friends about my own mental health at the time, how I was struggling to cope with that, the fear of loss, of losing your mum, the fear of I had older brothers, what impacted how on them, and my dad, who was still working and having to provide. And so I think the physical tasks are, to me, now I look back, were the easy bits. It's the emotional toll and the stress and the kind of anxiety that comes along with that.
You obviously use your first-hand experience to sort of guide yourself through conversations, I guess, you're having with young carers today. But now young carers today have just gone through this period of lockdown, something which our generation, carers before, hadn't had to deal with before. And you were asking the question throughout about how people were feeling, and you saw a marked change, didn't you, in terms of stress levels and anxiety. Can you give us a sense of the results that you saw through that survey work you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. What we recognised really early on was that young carers were picking up a huge burden right at the start of lockdown. But we needed to not just have some anecdotal information. So at Carers Trust, we carried out a survey, the biggest survey of young carers through the coronavirus pandemic, and actually the only survey that really measured the impact that was having on young carers. Some of the big stats were that over 66% of young carers said that they became more stressed because of coronavirus. Over 40% of young carers said their mental health deteriorated during that time. So that's a big proportion of the young carers across the UK who have really suffered during that time.
And of course, we've got to bear that in mind, that that's on top of the things that they were already experiencing before lockdown. So that's on top of the regular stress of being a young carer in a no-COVID world.
Absolutely. There's young carers consistently have told us for the last few years and way before that the impact that caring can have on their lives and their mental well-being, but also their kind of physical health if they don't look after themselves. Throw in the fact that then the paid care workers that would be going into their home had to stop. They had to pick up the stress of were they going to bring the virus back home themselves to the person that was vulnerable. They potentially had to pick up additional tasks of shopping and medication where other people weren't able to do that for them. Many young carers at that point started to feel the pressure, but their peers in school would have been undertaking Zoom calls with friends or WhatsApp calls with friends. Young carers weren't able to. They weren't able to reach out to peers because they were shockingly taking on more care at that point. And one of the biggest stats we saw was, believe it or not, there was just under 10% of young carers were providing over 90 hours of support a week at that point in time.
Give us a sense of that then in terms of timing, because for a lot of young carers, their school time, their education time is almost a period of respite where they can concentrate almost on themselves, albeit also while they're also doing science or geography, maths or English. And to remove that from a young carer's life presumably was became part of the reason why those stats became so stark.
Absolutely. I think for most young people, and most of us would look back and go, there was times when you didn't want to go to school and wanted to avoid it, but most young carers see that opportunity as respite from their caring role, the chance to be a normal young person. That's what they get when they're in school. And to take that away, to take that ability to have some time away from their caring role, just to have some time away from the stresses of that are really important. And the research that we did clearly shows that because young carers were unable to interact with peers, were able to have the support of teachers in some instances that understood their caring role, and because their caring role just increased overnight, really put a huge burden on young carers right at the start of the pandemic and throughout.
In terms of support that is out there for young carers, you touched on sort of local council support, those care packages. It was, I think, the COVID bill, which effectively reduced local councils' obligation to provide that care package. A lot of people will think, well, the COVID bill, that was about making sure Britain was ready to fight the pandemic. It's had some really upsetting, potentially, hazardous impacts on those young carers in a way which I think people would be shocked to hear. Can you give us a sense of the COVID bill and its impact on young carers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're absolutely right. The coronavirus bill was put in really quickly, and people saw it as the ability to keep the NHS functioning and to basically push money out the door to make sure that people were able to kind of remain in jobs. And the furlough scheme was probably the biggest piece of legislation that went through there, I suppose. But I think what people missed was it gave local authorities the ability to what we'll call easements, which basically meant that they could reduce care packages to basically support those that they felt needed more support during coronavirus. What that actually meant was that where local authorities felt that families could cope at home, that was fine, and care packages were reduced. But also young carers very often took the decision for themselves, for care organisations and care services not to come into their own home, because there was a real fear. There was a lack of PPE, as we know. At the time, there were people kind of entering their home to provide care without adequate protection. So whether it was a local authority decision or a young carer decision, that had a drastic impact on the number of hours that young carers were supporting the person at home, which meant they were doing much more manual labour tasks like bathing, changing, peg feeding, the stuff which you would normally have 2 or 3 years worth of professional training to undertake, and having to do that with potentially a parent, a sibling, a grandparent who, there's dignity involved in that as well. And young carers have just absolutely taken that on without even a second question during that time. But I think just to pick up, if I can, in terms of your point of support. So firstly, I just want to, say to anybody that feels either they are a young carer or feel they might be in that situation, they should visit our website, because our website does point them to their local support service. So if they visit carers.org and type in the postcode, it'll flag all of the young carers services, which are charity focused through our network, about where they can actually pick up support. So anybody that's listening should absolutely get support as well.
People, I think, who will hear this will think, well, that COVID bill, or the implications from the COVID bill, surely there should have been foresight when legislation was being drawn up, that people would say, oh, this is going to impact people who are both vulnerable, both the carer, but potentially the cared for individual, and potentially put people in a difficult position, or force them to make decisions that they otherwise aren't qualified to make or wouldn't be able to make. And I'm not saying there's malice behind the thoughts, but it seems to be an incredible oversight that the COVID bill has been allowed to have that impact on people who quite clearly need the support.
Yes, couldn't agree more. I think it was a piece of legislation that needed to be put in quickly. I get that. But it then took a further 4 or 5 months for us continually banging at the door of government to ensure that there was some additional guidance for young carers. It felt like there was a bit of feet dragging, to be fair, in terms of that. But the focus on ultimately young carers and carers more generally are the backbone of our civil society. Without them, our social care system would fall apart, because actually we just couldn't pick up the cost of replacing the care that they provide. And to then take an additional 4 or 5 months to issue guidance on how young carers should be supported was just appalling, really. And actually, I think our asks moving forward, that is much more proactive than reactive in terms of supporting young carers over what is going to be quite a challenging winter period, actually.
One of the interesting things, Gareth, that I found just in the brief time that I've been following this subject has been about the numbers. And when we talk about young carers, you can look online and you can look at different websites and you can see a whole host of different numbers that are thrown out there about young carers, because there's some people who will self-identify as a young carer. There'll be a young carer who doesn't identify in any way, shape or form. There'll be some who are known to authorities, others who aren't, known to schools, others who aren't as well. And we don't know the official number of young carers in the UK. We don't know how many there are. It seems something which we should know, and it's information we should hold, and yet we're still working off best guesses.
Absolutely. So the numbers going back, the official numbers are over nearly 10 years old, actually, because they come from the census in 2011. That question in the census didn't even really answer the question about young carers. Various surveys have been completed over the years, or various pieces of research. The most accurate one is a piece of research carried out by the BBC and Nottingham University, which estimated young carers between the ages of 11 and 16 to be 1 in 5 in every classroom. So that estimated about 800,000 young carers. You add onto that anybody below the age of 11, so in primary school, and anybody 17, the best estimates are about 1 million young carers across the UK, which I think for most of your listeners will be absolutely staggering to understand.
That number is huge, but also staggering that there hasn't been an authority or a government who've said these are clearly people who will need extra support. And I think you've also found evidence that people who are young carers do struggle more so within their education, that they are less likely to achieve the GCSE results as their non-caring peers.
Absolutely, a young carer ultimately has to make choices about their lives at that time that they're in, and as human beings, our approach is to always look after somebody that needs our help. You can never, particularly at a young age, predict, right, if I have to miss a day in school here or there, how will that impact me in 20 or 30 years time in terms of my career aspirations? I think, and that is where our support services across our network come into play, in terms of our Young Carers in Schools programme across England, Wales in particular, that works with schools to enable them to identify young carers and put support in place. So even if they are late for school, they miss a bit of homework because of their caring role, then teachers have the responsibility to support them through that and ensure that they are able to be treated as a normal young person and have the support available to them as well.
Gareth, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us on the programme today.
No problem. Thank you very much.
So that's Gareth Howells, the CEO of the Carers Trust. I'll put links to them up on the details page of the podcast itself. If you just type in Carers Trust, it is the first thing that comes up. Brilliant organisation. We heard from the Children's Society last week. Again, some wonderful organisations doing great work with young carers. But listening to our whole Young Carers Count campaign has been the leader of the Lib Dems, Sir Ed Davey. Now, I'm delighted to say Sir Ed has agreed to take forward some of the findings that we've had in regard to young carers to Parliament and take them forward, because he himself is passionate about supporting young carers, because, like Gareth was, Sir Ed himself was a young carer, and he told me all about it.
My mum became terminally ill when I was 12, and because my dad had died when I was 4, my brother and I did a lot of the caring for her. She was terminally ill with a very painful form of cancer called bone cancer, and we nursed her at home for 3 years until she died when I was 15. Like a lot of carers' experiences, you have a very loving relationship, but it was very challenging, and it was often upsetting and tiring, exhausting, and people around you, friends at school, didn't really quite understand what was going on in your life. But I'm conscious, by the way, that young carers have a wide variety of different experiences. In many ways, there's no such thing as a young carer, because, some young carers are looking after siblings who've got maybe physical disabilities. Some young carers are looking after their parents who either were dying, as in my case, or may have a mental health problem, may be physically disabled, may have a drug or alcohol problem. So the experience of young carers is very, very varied. And we should never generalize about young carers. We need to think about them as individuals, about the individual experience they are going through, and make sure, whether it's the school, whether it's social services, whoever it may be, they understand that individual young person and try to listen properly to them.
Obviously, those young carers have had that experience and a whole range of experiences in a whole range of different backgrounds, as you've suggested. And given the really difficult situation that you went through, when you add coronavirus, the pandemic, the lockdown on top of those responsibilities, that's something that no young person should have to face alone, is it?
Yeah, I can totally agree. I mean, I really worry about carers out there, and particularly young carers. I used to get some breaks by going to school. During the lockdown, they couldn't go to school. I used to get break by going and playing sport, when able to play sport. And so that relief, that respite, that break won't have been there for many young carers. And while they will, I'm sure in the vast majority of cases, really care about their relative, they need to have some escape just to get their mind in the right place. And if they don't, my really worry is their mental health could be impacted. Obviously, their educational chances could be impacted. And so I'm genuinely worried that what's happening out there, and we don't really have a feel for it. I mean, there are some surveys that are being undertaken, and they're not coming back with great results. I think people are being stressed, they're being anxious, and this is something that we need to give far more attention to, because, yeah, all young people are having problems during this pandemic, but I think young carers are amongst the group that need the most support.
Let's talk, if we can, about the political response for young carers. A lot of people, when they heard about the COVID bill going through Parliament, was thinking, well, OK, that's a response, and a pragmatic response to a global pandemic affecting people here in this country. When they later find out that COVID bill reduced the obligation of local councils to provide certain care packages to young carers, leaving some having to fend for themselves because of fears of the virus, because of lack of PPE, that was an unforeseen consequence that should have been foreseen by somebody, shouldn't it? That COVID bill shouldn't have impacted so negatively on those young carers.
Well, it wasn't totally unforeseen. In the second reading debate on that bill back in March, I raised the issue of people who needed support, not primarily young carers, but carers in general, disabled people in general. There's a whole category of people, including young carers, who local authorities would normally have some duty of support for. And in the Coronavirus Act, those responsibilities, those duties on local authorities were reduced. And I thought that at the time that was wrong. We tabled amendments to stop it. The government weren't interested. And when the bill came for renewal, I made it clear ahead of time to the Prime Minister that if those parts of the Coronavirus Act didn't come out, we would have to vote against it. And we did vote against the renewal in the end, not because we didn't think there were some parts of the bill that were needed, but we just wanted to make a stand on behalf of carers, young carers, disabled people, because we just think it's wrong that their rights should be taken away. Because at this stage, in many ways, they need more support, not less. So it just didn't make sense.
What damage could have been done during that time? A young carer without support from a local authority, having to make potentially, in some cases, their own decision about whether or not they want support to come into their house or not, while they're reading stories on social media, in the news, about this deadly virus, which is knocking at their front door. You can completely understand if they were to say, yeah, of course, don't come in. I'll have to take on that burden themselves. But that will come with consequences, won't it?
Yeah, without doubt. And I'm afraid we will discover those in the months and years ahead. I mean, I think for all of us, really, the coronavirus was a really anxious moment, is an anxious moment. I've got a disabled son who has got a neurological problem. He can't walk or talk. And, while I think he's quite robust in his health, fortunately, we're worried about how vulnerable he might be. And if you're looking after a parent who's ill, a parent who's disabled, a parent who's got some condition, or a sibling, a brother or sister's got some condition, you're going to be worried that they're going to be more vulnerable. And so that means that you're probably less likely to go out because you don't want to bring the virus back. And so you need that extra help. And so I don't know what's going on behind these closed doors. And we should be alarmed about this. And sometimes people suffer in silence and sort of grin and bear it, but it won't be good for people's health long term.
Yeah, both physical and of course, mental health as well. Can we talk about a lack of data? How is it in 2020 that we don't know how many young carers there are in the country? In the UK at the moment, young people caring for siblings, parents with severe disabilities in some cases, mental health issues, drug and alcohol abuse, and there's not a register. The local authorities don't have an official list of how many there are. If we ask the question, how many are there, all we get is best guesses. That can't be right, can it?
It isn't right. It needs to be changed. We need to work with schools and local authorities to get that data and get it properly recorded. Let me be clear, though, we're going to need some training for people on this, because some young carers don't realise they're a young carer. And if they don't actually immediately offer that up, that they are caring for somebody, and don't see it in that role, it may be that we're underestimating it. I've seen some estimates that suggest that in most classes of 30 young people, there'll be 2 or 3 young carers. Now, there may be 1 or 2 of those who've got, regularly, daily caring responsibilities. When they leave home in the morning and go back in the evening, they're caring immediately. They're caring at weekends, they're caring at school holidays. There'll be others who the caring responsibility is shared with another parent, another sibling, and so it's not all falling on their shoulders the whole time. So there'll be different experiences. And so identifying the carers in the first place, those young people who are caring in these different ways, is critical. And because until you're measuring it, we can't get a real handle on the level of support we need, the type of support we need, the way we need to ensure that educational and employment opportunities aren't lost, and so on and so forth. And there's a truism in politics: if you don't measure it, people don't know it's there, right? And so we've got to measure it, because then at least we can force governments and local governments to do more on it.
Is that a reason that governments haven't tried to measure it in the past? That they're worried what they might find? They're worried they might find something they suddenly need to invest in, find funding for? Is it easier just not to know and just presume that these carers will crack on as they always have done?
It may be. I don't always subscribe poor intentions to me. So maybe it just they haven't got around to it. But I think it's a mistake not to get around to it. And I would actually sort of question the assumption behind some people's view about this, that it's going to be an expense. Sometimes you have to pay money up front, but that actually helps in the long term, because the person is healthier, is able to work more. If you don't help people through the difficult times, and they themselves are therefore not able to contribute as much as they otherwise would have done, that means you're just not investing in the future. So helping young carers is an investment in the future. It's the right thing to do. It's also the sensible thing to do. And this is sometimes in the care debate we don't see, and it really demonstrates itself in young carers. If we can support them by identifying them, by listening to them, and then supporting them appropriately, then that's going to improve their life chances. And that's good for them, and it's good for the rest of us.
Our call to arms for the Young Carers campaign is to try and get the status of a young carer included in a school census. So as you pointed out, a school would need to identify a child, inform parents as to what young carers are, so that information can be passed through primary schools, secondary schools, would explain to a lot of teachers why a child maybe hadn't done their homework, would explain why a child was not able to go to a detention because they had caring responsibilities at home. Do you back that campaign, and do you back those calls for the school census to include that information of a child's young carer status?
Totally back it. It's a really good idea, and I think we should potentially even go further. I would want the Office for National Statistics to be brought in to make sure we've got the best form of statistics on young carers. It's essential that we have this for policy. It's also for the school. So you gave some very good examples about why a young person couldn't do a detention. But also, what happens if they're not able to do their homework because they've had caring responsibilities? What happens if they're late because they had to stay at home to look after the mother or the father for some reason? Often these young carers will get into trouble, and they may feel sort of either embarrassed or awkward about explaining why, because they don't want to talk about what's going on at home for completely understandable reasons. And then the teachers think they're a naughty kid. I mean, how wrong? That's just so wrong, isn't it? The pressure on these young people is so intense, can be so intense. And the last thing they want is extra stress and anxiety at school, and particularly when it's unfair. So that's why we've got to identify these young people, and then we've got to really listen to them. And I keep going back to this listening point because I just think every young person is different anyway, and every young carer is different anyway. And unless the teachers in the school really understand what's going on in that person's life, they can't really help them. By the way, they can't educate them as well. And this can be a barrier to education. So it's really important that the school does understand what's going on in that person's life. I mean, I went to a great school, but they didn't know I was a young carer. They didn't put anything in place.
But actually, that idea that if a primary school is handing over information to a secondary school and says, you're going to have 45, 50 kids in this cohort who are young carers, that school will then feel that they have to bring in an expert, somebody who can train staff into how to maybe potentially speak to those young people about their caring needs. They'd have to have those conversations, and they'd also be able to identify those children. So if they did spot things which otherwise they would normally class as the naughty kids, activities, they would know the truth, and that would be positive, because then that has less of a stigma. I'll give you the example. One young carer said to me she believes there's a stigma around young caring due to lack of information and ignorance, and she said that often it's only when things get really bad that there's a local authority intervention. Whereas if there was a more soft approach from earlier on, then that child wouldn't feel that stigma, would also be able to speak out more and say, I've been flagged as a young carer, well, here's what I need some help on at the moment. And again, that reduced stigma allows that conversation to take place, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is about reducing stigma. I think actually it's also about upskilling people in the schools, because we can't necessarily expect every single teacher to know what to do. Maybe it needs to be part of their basic teacher training course. Maybe it should be part of the ongoing development of them as professionals in the inset days that they have in different schools. I think it's so important because we're not talking about a group of children that's a tiny, tiny minority. This is quite a lot. Every teacher will almost certainly have a young carer in one of their classes, possibly several. And I came at this from two angles. I came at it both from the young carers side and also for young people who are bereaved, because I'd lost both my parents when my mum died. And again, the school didn't really know how to handle it. I remember being said, by the head teacher, we've never had orphans before, which wasn't the easiest way to sort of broach the subject with me, and I think understanding that in any class there'll be one person who's lost one or more parents, 2 or 3 carers, and giving teachers some skills to know how to deal with it, even if it's about both recognizing and then having an empathy with them so that they can point them to the school counselor, the school nurse, somebody who can actually be there and be a support for that young person and listen to them.
So, Sir Ed, during your conference speech, you said you wanted to be the voice of carers, in Parliament. We've spoken about the issue facing young carers and a potential part solution to some of those issues with the school census idea. Is that something now that you can take forward through Parliament? Is that something you can action?
Absolutely. I will campaign. I'd like to do it cross-party so that we can all achieve this, because it's not difficult, it's not expensive, and it will get that data to enable us to act. But I don't think we need to wait just till we get the data. There's lots of things that we should do. So as a Liberal Democrat, we have argued, for example, that a young person could be conceived to be eligible for the carers allowance, which is a payment made to people who are caring for someone more than 35 hours a week. We've argued that there's a very strong case for young carers to have a bus pass. We've argued that they should get extra support in their education and then as they leave school in employment opportunities. In other words, tailoring packages to young people who've had these extra pressures on them that may have made life that much more difficult for them. And so, yes, we should get the data, but I don't think my key point to you is let's not wait. There's lots of things that we could do to help young people now. And there is some good practice out there, by the way. There are people and schools and local authorities who do some good stuff for young carers. Let's ensure that young carers, wherever they live, whichever school they go to, get that extra help.
Sir Ed Davey, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.